Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Just a couple of things for today. First of all, here we are, your presenters today. I'm Sarah Glidden. I'm a program manager for the Cultural Investment Portfolio. That's the name that we give to our organizational support grant programs. That includes the portfolio, the gateway, and our projects grants. I'm joined today by my colleague, Kaylin. Kaylin, go ahead and give a shout out.
Hi, everyone. Program Officer, Cultural Investment Portfolio. Looking forward to talking with all of you.
So we're going to ask you, if you have questions, to please put them in the Q&A, not in the chat. And we're going to do our best to answer them either in the Q&A function or out loud as we go through the presentation. Some of the questions you ask might be things that we are going to get to, in which case we will wait until we are at that point in the presentation. If you're looking at our screen, you can see two boxes with no faces in them. Many of you have previously worked with our colleagues Cheyenne Cohn-Pastel and Michael Ibrahim. Cheyenne has moved to a different position at Mass Cultural Council, and Michael has moved on to wonderful new exciting opportunities. So we are in the process of hiring two new program officers who will be starting in the next months, very soon. So our agenda for today is to go over what is the cultural investment portfolio, and in particular the portfolio grants, the formula, which is how we determine grant amounts, what kinds of organizations are eligible, how do you get your fiscal 22 grant, that's the grant for the year that we are currently in, and then how do you make sure that you get a grant for fiscal 23, and then open it up for other questions. But we will, like I said, try to address your questions as we go through our program today. So hear me. There we go. So what is the cultural investment portfolio? Again, that's the name that we give broadly to our organizational support programs, both operating support and project support. And what we are here for today is to talk specifically about your annual requirements for the portfolio and for the Gateway program so that you get a grant for next year. So this is a combination of your annual requirements for this year's grant, which basically functions as the application for next year's grant. The portfolio grants are unrestricted operating support. That means you can spend these funds on anything that you need to spend funds on, whether it is the toilet paper budget or staff salaries or purchase of equipment. There are no restrictions on how you spend this money. The grant amount that you receive is based on a formula that mathematically calculates based on factors that I'm going to go into in just a second. And this is the largest of the funding programs at Mass Cultural Council. The portfolio itself is a program that we started in 2010, so here we are in its 12th year. Currently, there are 313 organizations funded in the portfolio, and these are organizations who mostly prior to 2010 had a long-term, consistent history of success in competitive applications with Mass Cultural Council. So because of that long-term success, in 2010, they were put into the portfolio. Other organizations have been moved into the portfolio since then through our Gateway program. In 2022, this accounts for $6.2 million in grants awarded. And these grants range from $5,000 to $60,000. And we also have 32 organizations currently in our Gateway program and 176 organizations that are receiving project grants. Those are both for organizations that are not in the portfolio, so you can't double dip into the different programs. It's one or the other. Just a reminder of the basic eligibility requirements. You have a fully cultural mission. That means that your primary mission is around arts, humanities, or interpretive sciences. And by interpretive sciences, we are talking about organizations that interpret the natural world for the greater public. So things like zoos, aquariums, watershed alliances, botanical gardens, environmental educational programs, things of that sort. As an organization, you either have your own incorporation and 501c3 status, or you meet our definition of a cultural affiliate. And a cultural affiliate is a fully cultural program that exists within a larger organization that doesn't meet our fully cultural eligibility. A lot of these organizations are programs at colleges and universities, such as college art museums, literary publications, things of that sort. Some of them also exist within social service organizations. The organizations that we fund in this program have to offer public cultural programming in Massachusetts annually and maintain year-round operations. Just want to flag, maintaining year-round operations doesn't mean that you are programming year-round. A lot of our organizations program only in the summer. We're only in the September to May sort of academic year schedule, but there is always an organization that exists with people who can respond to emails, answer the phones, etc. To be in this program, you have to have minimum annual cash expenses of $50,000 based on a 3-year average. So we take 3 years of your cash expenses, average them out. They have to be at least $50,000. So if you have a $40,000 year and a $60,000 year, that averages out to 50. And I'm going to get into an exception around that shortly. And again, to know that you have to abide by federal and state regulations which bar discrimination. These are the law, so every organization should be doing that, whether they receive a grant from us or not. So again, I mentioned based on your cash expenses, and we determine your cash expenses on your reporting through the Data Arts Cultural Data Profile, and Kaylin's going to be talking about that more. This doesn't include in-kind expenses or pass-through funds. So if part of your activity is receiving funds and then passing them on to other organizations or individuals, that's not included. That would also mean if you act as a fiscal agent for other organizations. Those income and expenses belong to the organization that you are acting as a fiscal agent for. They are not your expenses. And again, based on a 3-year average. So 1 year that plummets down is not going to kick you out. We get asked this question a lot. What makes the grant amount change, and how do we determine the grant amount? We base this again on this 3-year average, the floor of $5,000 as our minimum grant, the cap of $60,000 as our maximum grant, and then how much money we have to allocate to this program. What changes your grant amount from 1 year to the next is either your expenses increase or decrease relative to other organizations in the portfolio. So you might not change at all, but all of the other organizations increase. That would mean you have decreased relative to other organizations in the portfolio. And this also is about how much money the Mass Cultural Council is able to allocate to this particular grant program. And we always flag, this is one reason why your advocacy to your elected officials is so important, because that's what determines our budget. It's been a strange couple of years. I'm just going to say that right up front. It's been a strange couple of years. And typically, we have always based your grant amount on your 3 most recently completed, closed out, reported to us fiscal years. So you've not only finished that fiscal year, but you've had the appropriate amount of time to have your financial reports audited, the audit completed, your tax return completed, and then time to input that information into the Data Arts program. So for some organizations, this might have meant the 3 most recent years. For some organizations, let's say if your fiscal year ended January 31st, we actually have a couple of organizations like that. We're not going to expect that you can get all of that reporting done in time to report to Data Arts in May of the same year. So some organizations would be looking at calendar 21, some organizations maybe calendar 20 if that's their fiscal year. We made an exception in fiscal 22, and I'm pretty sure you can guess why. What we recognized was that in our fiscal 22 grants, normally we would be looking at fiscal 2019, 18 for some organizations and 17, 18, 19 for other organizations. So that would mean that some of our grantees, we would be starting to include pandemic impacted years in your grant determination. And for some organizations, we wouldn't. And that seemed to be a problem to us. So we went back, and for your fiscal 22 grant, the grant you're getting for the year that you are in right now, we only looked at fiscal 17, 18, 19. I'm just going to note here for a second. I can see that people are putting information into the chat. If you could put your questions into the Q&A, we would greatly appreciate it. It'll be much easier for us to track that we have responded to your questions. So for fiscal 23, we're going to go back to your 3 most recently completed and reported fiscal years. So some organizations we're going to be looking at 18, 19, and 20. And for some organizations, we'll be looking at 19, 20, and 21. And I'm going to answer a question I see in the Q&A. We will be making a recording of this and the slide deck available to everyone after the event is over. So going back to this fiscal 23 grant determination issue, one of our primary goals in this program has been to have dependable and reasonably predictable grant amounts. And for the most part, that has been true. Your grants have mostly increased because of increases to our allocation. And because organizations' expenses don't typically change drastically from one year to the next. We know that that's going to be an issue that our formula is going to start seeing in our determination of fiscal 23 and fiscal 24 grants. So we can't tell you what the grant amounts are going to be, but I do expect that there's going to be a little less predictability in determining our fiscal 23 grants. And just to give you some timeline information, we can't calculate fiscal 23 grants until we know what our fiscal 23 budget allocation is from the Commonwealth. That typically does not get finalized until July at the earliest. We always hope for July. That's a good thing, but we can't guarantee it. So we get our budget from the Commonwealth. We finish planning our spending plan for the following fiscal year, and our governing council reviews and approves that spending plan at their August meeting. So you will find what your fiscal 23 grant amount is after the council reviews and approves the spending plan, typically in the final week of August. Just want to point out some temporary changes to our requirements. In the past, we've had an ongoing requirement around what has been called either an engagement requirement or a site visit, because again, things have been rather tumultuous in the last couple of years, and because a lot of organizations are not doing travel and in-person meetings yet, we have suspended this engagement requirement for fiscal 22. We're also taking a deep look at what that requirement means for the future, and we'll probably be rolling out some new plans around that. Also, for some of our smaller organizations, we definitely have organizations that dropped below that $50,000 in either fiscal 20 or fiscal 21. Maybe dropped below it enough that their 3-year average has dropped below $50,000. And what we have determined is if your 3-year average of expenses has dropped below $50,000 due to either your fiscal 20 or 21 financial data, we're not going to be suspending your organization from this grant program, which is something that would have happened prior to fiscal 20. So you'll still be in the portfolio as you are in the current guidelines, and you'll probably be at our minimum grant amount of $5,000 because that's where your cash expenses would put you, but that will not result in a suspension from the grant program. And then we'll be looking at your fiscal 22 finances and your fiscal 23 and going forward. And there is still a requirement that you have a one-to-one match, which means that you have double in expenses the amount of the grant that we give you. So if you're getting a $5,000 grant, you have to have at least $10,000 in expenses. If your organization completely suspended programming and activities and had no revenue or expenses, that's something that we should definitely be talking about. So I can tell, because we now have access to our wonderful new grants management system, I can tell that about half of our organizations have not yet downloaded their contract and sent it in to start getting payments made to them. So want to make sure that you know that your grant contract, unless you are an organization that has a hold, and there's only about 3 of those, your grant contract is available now in our new grants management system. That grants management system is called Smart Simple. You'll see that in the URL for this access. The only person who can access that contract is the person who has been identified as your primary contact person for the cultural investment portfolio. So if you have multiple people at your organization who have access to your account in Smart Simple and you cannot see the contract, then you are probably not the person who is the designated contact person. If you should be the designated contact person, go ahead and send me an email and we will update the records. But in the meantime, the person who is the designated contact is the person who can get into the system, download the contract, and mail it. Good old-fashioned snail mail, US mail, or carrier pigeon. Actually deliver the physical copy to the Mass Cultural Council office. And this year we have asked for everybody to provide new electronic fund transfer forms and new W-9s to Mass Cultural Council, even if that information hasn't changed. We've completely updated the grants management system. We want to make sure that we have the most recent up-to-date information on all of these issues. You will know that we have received your grant because Cindy, God bless Cindy, will enter it into the grants management system and you'll be able to see that it has been received. So we're not going to write or email or call all 313 of you when we get the contract. You will know we've gotten the contract because it will result in changes to your profile online and money showing up in your bank account. And I'm going to show you a screen of what that looks like. So this is the login portal for the grants management system, hoping at this point that all of you have seen this. If you as a person are logging in for the very first time, you should probably go to this section of new to the system, register. You can log in. You can check and see if you actually have an account. There's a place where you can search for your organization by its legal name. So if you have a doing business as that's different from your legal name, you need to look it up by your legal name and attach your profile to your organization. And at that point, we can make the change so that you are the designated person for that account. Once you've logged in, this is what you're going to see, a dashboard of current grant opportunities, which your organization may or may not be eligible for. All of our local cultural councils, your profile, which is your personal profile, the organization profile, where you can enter information about your organization. You can see that this particular person or organization has no applications in progress, none submitted currently, has 6 in the past that were approved or declined, has 0 payments. So if we have received your contract and a payment has been made to you, you're going to see a 1 there. And then this organization requires attention, one contract package. So that tells us that the contract has not been, if you have downloaded it, we haven't gotten it back from you. So you can download it by clicking on the contract package. So I'm going to pass it over to Kaylin, who can talk about your fiscal 23 grants and other requirements. And Kaylin, passing it to you, and I will take over answering questions in the chat.
Great, thank you. So reiterating
that Q&A, just to be clear.
That this webinar is for organizations that are currently funded in the cultural investment portfolio. And we can throw a funding list into the chat if you're not sure if that's you or not. So if your organization receives portfolio support, you reapply by continuing to meet the eligibility requirements that Sarah outlined earlier, and by meeting all annual reporting requirements by the annual deadlines. Again, they function as a final report and reapplication for the following year. Everything that I'm going to be discussing is outlined in detail on our website in an application process webpage. Next slide. Great. There are two major pieces to our annual reporting requirements. There is first the data profile and funder report, which is completed through SMU Data Arts, which is formerly known as the Cultural Data Project. That is a third-party system that we do not have access to. Other funders use it as well for their reporting. You can also use it for some robust analytics. There is also the annual report for the Cultural Investment Portfolio Program, which is owned by us and is completed through our new grants management system. We will go through both of those in detail. So the timeline for reporting every year, both are available now, but we want you to complete both sections when they are fresh in your mind and relevant. Hence the second bullet point under each of these items. So they're both available now. They're both due May 31st to avoid a penalty to your FY23 grant amount. But the data profile, we want you to complete by your organization's self-selected month deadline. At some time in the past, someone at your organization, maybe you, selected a month deadline for completing the cultural data profile and funder report. It should be about 9 months after your fiscal year ends or shortly after you typically get your audit back in any given year. There's no penalty for missing the month deadline. It's to help your own reporting schedule and our review schedules to spread it out over the course of the year. If you're not sure what your month deadline is, you can check in your organizational profile of the new grants management system. The annual report is also open now, but we want you to wait until May to fully complete it. Again, to make sure that everything is up to date at that point for all grantees. Next slide. So you mentioned that all of these reports, both of these reports separately have to be completed by May 31st to avoid penalties. What are those penalties? If you don't complete both of these reports by the deadline, there's a 25% penalty to your grant for the following year. There's a built-in extension for an additional week until June 7th. And if you still haven't completed the requirements by that time, the organization is suspended for the following year and won't receive a grant for that fiscal year for FY23. So there is, can we get an extension? Answer is yes and no. For the annual report, no. It must be completed by May 31st to receive an FY23 grant without penalty. It's a very short report, and it's what confirms that you are still eligible to the program. So it's important for us to have that information in a timely manner. For the data arts, cultural data profile and funder report, yes, it's possible to get an extension beyond May 31st or beyond that built-in June 7th deadline if your audit has been delayed. So in order to request an extension, you will need to send your cultural investment portfolio program contact a letter requesting the extension. You'll need to include a letter from your auditor that explains the reason for the delay, and you'll need to send us your unaudited financial statements for the correct fiscal year.
And I'm just going to jump in here for a second. That is the COVID-related reason for the delay.
Yes, yes. We know that that has been an effect for a number of nonprofits. So we'll need to receive all of those materials by May 31st at 11:59 p.m., just like we would have received the cultural data profile and funder report. So it's not just receiving the request from you by that deadline, we need to receive all of the materials by that deadline. So it's a good idea to try and do it a couple of days early to make sure that we can respond back to you and confirm that, yes, we have everything we need from you to count for that extension. In a case of an extension like this, we will use your unaudited financial statements to calculate your grant amount in the formula, the way that Sarah mentioned. And there will be a hold on your FY23 grant amount until we receive the data arts funded report from you. The hold doesn't go forever. We do need to receive the data profile and funder report by September 30th of the following year to receive an FY23 portfolio or gateway grant.
And just one thing I'd like to throw in here is that once you've gotten your completed audited financial statements and done the data arts, you might be reporting a number to us that is higher than the number that was in your unaudited financial statements. We are not going to recalculate your grant so that it goes up at that point, but we might recalculate your grant so that it goes down. So you're better to have the right numbers to us by May 31st so we can calculate it properly. Your final financial data reported to us through the data arts could result in the grant calculation going down, will not result in the grant calculation going up.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, for going through that. Next slide, great. A little bit more about the data profile and funder report requirement, because there are a few steps. And I'm throwing the link to where you complete this into the chat. It's culturaldata.org. So the data arts requirement is complete once an organization has done the following. First, you need to create a new CDP survey and enter data for the most recently completed fiscal year. For most organizations, that will be FY21. For some organizations, it's FY20. It depends on what your fiscal year end is and how long it takes for you to get your finances audited. Most organizations need to be reporting under 21. If you have questions about which one is you can ask us or look at in the cultural data system and see what you entered last year, because you need to enter a new one. Then you need to generate the CIP funder report, which pulls in 3 years of cultural data profile information and puts it into a report in the way that we want to see it. Make sure that you download the PDF of that and actually take a look through it. Because the cultural data profile has changed the way it's structured from year to year, there might be some weird gaps that you feel like don't fully tell the story of what your organization is doing. So take a look. If you need to reopen a profile and make edits, you can contact the help desk to do that. The third piece is to receive staff approval of your funder report. So we take a final look, see if it's complete, see if it's accurate. If there are errors or we have questions, we will be in touch with you and ask you to make some changes. And if you need help with completing any of these, again, it's a third-party system. They are fantastic. There's the Data Arts Support Center. They have great hours. They're open until 8 p.m. at night. They'll stay on the phone with you for 2 hours to help you complete these. They're great people. They also have a lot of resources online. And with great timing, there's one next week. There's a training that is outlined on the next slide, Sarah, called Getting Started with the Cultural Data Profile. It's February 24th at 4 o'clock. and it covers the basics. So if you've never done this before, try and make sure to go to that. They do one every month. So if you can't make it this month, you have an opportunity again in March, April, and May. It also might be a good refresher if you haven't done this in a while to see some of the new sections that they have put together in their more recent updates to the system.
Kaylin, I just want to jump in here to answer a question. You do not need to send us the PDF or a paper copy of the funder report. When you choose Mass Cultural Council and the Portfolio Grant Program to submit your funder report to, it shows up in our portal as administrators for the account. We can see that you've done that, and that allows us to download the report. It allows us to download that information both individually for the organization and in aggregate for all of the applicants or grantees to the program, which is incredibly helpful. We use a lot of that information around advocacy and other purposes.
Great, thank you. If you have other questions about the cultural data project, the profile, the funder report, you can throw them into the Q&A. But until then, I'm going to move on and talk about the second piece of our annual reporting requirements that you need to do in order to get an FY23 grant, which is our annual report. So the Cultural Investment Portfolio Annual Report is completed in our new grants management system. The link is on the slide and we can throw it into the chat. The annual report serves as a confirmation of your organization's ongoing eligibility. It acts as a final report for the current year and as an application for funding for the following year. It's very simple, and I will walk through the sections momentarily. So some quick navigation for you. In the grants management system, when you log in, you'll see a bunch of options for ways to interact with the system. If you scroll down, you'll see a requires attention section, and you can see the pending reports option. So the screen grab I have here, you can see one pending report. Again, if you're not seeing anything there, it could be for a number of reasons, but it's probably that you are not currently listed as the primary contact for your organization in our system, in which case be in touch with Sarah or myself and we can get you set up in the system.
And because pending reports might be more than one, because you might have a grant from another Mass Cultural Council or local cultural council program, and those would also have their own reporting requirements. Exactly.
If you click on the next slide, this is what it will look like. You'll see the number of pending reports here. You'll want to select the one that says CIP Portfolio. And then on the next slide, here's a quick look at what it actually looks like when you enter the report. Now we're going to run through the sections and the content of the report briefly. Sorry, next slide. Great. Okay, here's a brief outline of the content of the annual report. There's the attestation section, which is confirmation that your organization has completed its contractual requirements, that you're still eligible, the anti-discrimination requirements, advocacy activities, other policies. Then there's a section on ethics and accountability that I will talk about with more detail in a minute. You'll also confirm that your contact information is up to date, like executive leadership, your CIP grant contact, your NEA coordinator. Then there's also a brief organization review section where you confirm your mission and core programming. By core programming, we mean broadly defined programs, not specific titles of exhibits or performances or workshops or things that change from year to year. We're looking for evergreen language about what it is that you do, language that we can share with other stakeholders and legislators. Then the last two sections, Mass Cultural Council receives funding from the National Endowment for the Arts. And as a recipient of federal funds, Mass Cultural Council and in turn, our grant recipients are required to report on specific information to the NEA to document our granting activities. So there are two sections of the attestations section that I want to highlight. Grant recipients are required to credit Mass Cultural Council for funding. You go back for a slide for a second. Our logo is a couple years old now, but we still see the old version of the logo occasionally on organizations' websites and printed materials. So double check that. Make sure that you are using our new logo. There are additional guidelines on how to credit the Mass Cultural Council for funding in your contract package. And there's an online credit and publicity kit that we can also link to. The next piece under the attestation section is advocacy. We ask organizations through this program to conduct 2 advocacy activities annually, and that is to encourage the state's continued support, to help legislators who are the authorizers of funding for the Mass Cultural Council, to explain to them in concrete and in personal terms the social and economic benefit of supporting a vibrant cultural community and their districts through the work that your organization does. So we ask that you talk to state senators, state representatives, or the governor. We're not looking at our federal representatives or the president. We're looking at the state level. And we want you to be talking about the cultural community on a whole. It's not just for one particular project or something that you are working on. This needs to be a direct contact and not simply attending an event that includes members of the legislature. We're hoping that you can build a relationship. There's a lot of information and a lot of guidance on how to do this best through our partner, masscreative.org. Okay, the next section in the annual report is ethics and accountability. Organizations funded through the Cultural Investment Portfolio are expected to uphold provisions governing the operations of public charities and ethics and standards determined by professional associations. 2 policies specifically that we call out for FY23 funding are a policy on ethics and best practices for boards, which needs to be annually affirmed, and a policy on sexual harassment. So we instituted this policy a couple of years ago. All of your organizations, if you're receiving funding this year, should have these things in place already. But again, the policy on ethics and best practices needs to be annually affirmed. And if you have questions about any of these things, we have some resources for you. We did a webinar a couple of years ago when we rolled out this requirement, and there are additional resources on the state level for how to create these policies. Now back to the annual report for the National Endowment for the Arts sections. We are required to collect this information in the way that the NEA has outlined it for us and other grant recipients of theirs. But we as Cultural Council staff can help guide you through these sections if you have questions when you're completing them. We ask you to report on the grant year itself, so July 1st, 2021 through June 30th, 2022. It's another reason to wait until May to actually complete this annual report, certainly this section of the annual report, because it's going to ask you attendance, population benefit information that you might need to project ahead of in order to complete this by May 31st. But you should have a pretty good idea of what your population benefit information is by May, whereas in February might not be quite as accurate. So do your best, report on all of your activity, not just a particular program. Another quick note is that you'll see in the report, it asks for the number of artists engaged in person. And by artists, we mean humanists, scientists. The Mass Cultural Council funds much more broadly than just the term artists. So if those other terms and definitions apply to you, use that. The last NEA activity component of the annual report is whether you conducted activities at a location other than your organization's mailing address. And we want you to enter only up to 5. So that should be where you have the most programmatic activity if it is not at your organization's mailing address.
Kaylin, hi. I wanted to just jump in a bit on the participation numbers. We got a question from a lot of organizations last year, organizations that had not done in-person programming. The NEA questions actually specify for the population benefited in-person participation. So if your number is quite low because you did your programming mostly online rather than in person, we really want it to be that low number. And I know this is contrary to every feeling you have ever had in filling out a report where you want to put the increased number. But really, if the number is 0 for in-person participation, put 0 and consider the fact that this tells the NEA how drastically the COVID pandemic has impacted our ability to serve people in person. So this is not going to be any sort of ding against you. It is simply a fact of how the world has operated in the last 2 years. When the NEA asks the question about the artist participating, it does not use the language that specifies in person. So you can use all of that. So
great.
So
back to you.
Yeah, so we've got an ongoing relationship with the Data Arts folks, and Data Arts a couple of years ago merged with Southern Methodist University, which is really one of the leaders in doing research and advocacy for funding of the cultural sector. And coming out of that, they do a whole lot of different workshops that we think are particularly interesting and useful. So here you are. You have spent the time to put data into the Data Arts system. Let's put that information to work for you. So we invite you to join us on March 2nd at 2 p.m. I'm going to be sending out another set of emails inviting people to register for this. This is a whole section about the reporting tools and analytics that are available to you through the Data Arts site. This is all kinds of ways that you can benchmark your organization against other similar organizations or geographical organizations, and an overview of the national research that SMU Data Arts has been doing that puts your data into context. I think it'll be really interesting, and there's some really great tools that can come out of this. The second one is a session on April 13th. This is called Assessing Organizational Performance with Key Intangible Performance Indicators. It's a bit of a mouthful. It gets abbreviated to KIPPIs, which sounds rather charming. The KIPPIs are ways to evaluate what your organization looks like in ways that are not specifically related to financial data. And particularly as the world has shifted so much, this can be a way to look at your organization, not through the financial lens, but through intangible lenses that can be drawn out of some of the data that you provide in the Data Arts survey. So it's an analytic tool powered by the data that you've entered that offers insights into your organization's unique strengths and areas for potential growth. And this could be something that's really valuable to you in how you communicate with stakeholders and with other potential funders. So I think it's going to be really useful. And like I said, I'm going to be sending out another email with links to register for these 2 sessions. So we've got 3 sessions coming up. The first one, a review of the Data Arts profile and how to put your data into it. The second, the session on how to use that data in a variety of ways. And third, this session around the KIPPIs. So to register, you'll be able to go to our agency dates section of our website. I think a lot of folks don't realize how much information there is, but if you go to our homepage, you will see agency dates. And if you click on that, you will see basically everything that we're doing, every public activity, every workshop, every webinar, every grant application, deadline, information session, office hours, etc. It's all there in the agency dates section, and you can filter it in a variety of ways to get specifically to the information that you need for whatever purpose. So thank you for joining us and sitting through this. And we know we've been answering a couple of questions as we've gone along, but we are happy to hear more questions. And at this point, I've got our chat and our Q&A open. I'm just going to put our email addresses in the chat. You can also find these on our website. That's Kaylin and me. And like I said, we are really excited. We're going to be welcoming 2 new program officers fairly shortly. We will send out introductions to them, and we'll be particularly sending out introductions to the organizations where those folks will be your primary contacts, and looking forward to getting to know you better. It appears that we have answered all of the questions that you have. Kind of amazing. Oh, this is a great question that's just come in through the Q&A. And for grants of $5,000 or less, you get the entire grant amount when you've returned your signed completed contract to us. We put in for you to receive the entire grant amount at once. If your grant amount is more than $5,000, you get 80% of the grant when you finish that first set of paperwork. You get the final 20% in June after you've done your data arts. So once you've done the data arts reporting for the end of this year, we will provide you with that last 20% of your grant. All the more reason to get it done early. And yes, the signed executed contract will be mailed to you. So you will get that for your own files. Seeing a few more questions popping up. And this is a question about exhibits in community spaces and whether or not you should be trying to estimate engagement. Absolutely, do the best you can. We know in any space where you don't have a ticketed admissions controlled process, you are doing an estimate. Give it your best effort and best of luck to you. Well, thank you again. We're going to wrap it up for today. We wish you the very best. Have a wonderful President's Day weekend. And we really look forward to seeing you in your places of work, in your organizations, online, and really, really looking forward to getting to visit organizations again. So best of luck to all of you.